Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our September Outdoor Florida webinar by the Office of Greenways and Trails. My name is Doug Alderson, and today we are featuring Keith Laakkonen. I hope I get pronounced that right, sorry, and Executive Director of the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, managed by the National Audubon Society. This is the largest stand of old-growth bald cypress left in the world, and Keith will discuss the wildlife that lives there, why the sanctuary is so important for Southwest Florida, how it was established, and work underway to protect and restore its habitat. Before we get started, I have a couple of reminders. At the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer portion, so please hold your questions until then. You can use the chat at the bottom. If a question comes to you, just write it in there. And please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on the Florida State Parks YouTube channel. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start. Website in the future. Let me introduce Keith. Keith oversees management of the 13,450 acre sanctuary and its 25 full-time and part-time staff responsible for land conservation, research, policy, and public engagement. He is charged with advancing Audubon's science-based conservation mission to protect the sanctuary and its watershed. He serves as a key Audubon spokesperson for conservation of the Western Everglades and works closely with Audubon Florida leadership to achieve Audubon's conservation goals in the region. So thank you again, Keith, for taking the time to speak to our webinar today. I am going to hand it over to you now, so please go ahead and share your screen.
Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. Let me share my screen. So first off, I just want to say something. I want to congratulate Doug Alderson. This is his last day. He is retiring, and long before I worked for Audubon, I spent many years at DEP, and I've been a career biologist. I've lived in Florida my whole life, and Doug is a name you know. He has written several books. Check him out in the bookstore, and just wish him the best. He's been a true public servant. And, you know, those who've got to know him or at least know his reputation know that he has been very committed to nature and helping protect the state of Florida. So thank you, Doug, for all that you have done for the state of Florida.
Oh, thank you very much, Keith. That's wonderful. Thank you.
So my name is Keith Laakkonen. I am the director of Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. I've been there for a little over a year and a half now. And full disclaimer, because life works this way sometimes, I'm working from home and there's contractors who are doing some work. So if you hear some banging, I apologize. I'm in the quietest room I can possibly find in the house right now. But of course, they would show up right when this webinar starts. So National Audubon Society is pretty substantial. There's over 600 individual chapters. I think there's something like 60,000 members nationwide. We have 41 centers, as well as several sanctuaries. Corkscrew Swamp actually has a Blair Center and a sanctuary, so we have both. And you'll see the clustering there in that map that there's a whole bunch in the state of Florida, and I think something like 40%, 30 or 35% of our state of the National Audubon staff are actually based in the state of Florida. So we are here because migration really connects us across the Americas. You know, Audubon is about bird conservation and about conservation in general. You know, this time of year, as we look to our skies, we see our swallowtail kites are beginning to leave. I heard they counted several hundred in the Keys yesterday during Hawk Watch. Those birds are heading down to South America. So, you know, when you see a bird in your yard, you know, except for things like cardinals, you know, you start to get your red starch, you start to get your buntings, you start to get catbirds, you know, so we're so lucky we get to share these birds certain times a year with other parts of the planet and the continent. But we do have a problem in the US. We have a bird curve, which is going the wrong way. We've lost almost 3 billion birds since 1970. Loss of habitat, climate change, pesticide use, and collision with buildings. And so Audubon's new goal is to bend that bird curve. We do have some good news. Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, our mission is to preserve Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary and support the conservation and restoration of natural ecosystems throughout the Western Everglades. We use science-driven land stewardship and education to protect birds, other wildlife, and people. And that's a lot to say that, we're going to talk about the sanctuary today, but we don't just work within our borders. We work all across Southwest Florida. So we're really committed to the Western Everglades ecosystem. So some important dates for Audubon. Audubon, Florida, this year is celebrating our 125th anniversary. A pretty big deal. And this started in the 1880s when the plume hunters were decimating South Florida wading birds. At one point, a pound of wading bird feathers was worth more than a pound of gold. And so it was a real threat. Audubon stepped in with wardens to help protect birds throughout the U.S. And this is a picture of Guy Bradley. Guy Bradley is unfortunately famous because he later went to the Florida Keys, Florida Bay, and was murdered by poachers, which led to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and some of the protections we have today. In the 1950s, there was serious logging of cypress forests all through South Florida. A lot of this was done during the baby boom, but also to help rebuild Europe after World War II. And they started logging these swamps from Pakahatchee and were marching their way to the north. But luckily, by 1954, the local community came together and we saved the old growth bog forest from logging. They purchased the first 5,600 acres and donated to National Audubon Society. Because of that action, today we have at Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary the largest stand of old growth cypress forest on the planet. And I say sometimes we're more national park than most national parks. 1956, we built our first boardwalk, 5,600 feet into the swamp. It took nearly 2 years. Backbreaking labor, they didn't have the equipment they had back then. It was just a few guys with a lot of hard work and some hand tools. So, of course, our main feature, which you probably know and heard us for and hopefully visited, if not, you should visit soon, is come surround yourself with giants. There's 500-year-old trees all over this place. And these trees are amazing. You can see that this big one here is leaning over. It's got strangler figs on it. On top of strangler figs are orchids and mosses. And these things are like little coral reefs just going into the air. So it's a really complex, really dynamic ecosystem out there. And it's one of the few places you can walk in a swamp and keep dry. And the wildlife, of course, on the boardwalk is what really people get excited about. We have the super ghost orchid. As far as we know, this is the largest ghost orchid in the world. It is so prolific. It just finished its third round of blooming this year. At one point, we had 4 different flowers on it. This is the ghost orchid, which is from the book, The Orchid Hunter, Orchid Thief, and also a very bad movie adaptation of that book. But it's absolutely incredible that we have this diversity. And we're able actually to show this orchid, even as rare as it is, because it's 70 feet away from the boardwalk. It's 80 feet up in the air, protected by alligators. So we're not really worried about poachers there. Also, painted buntings. I mean, all the bird life. Our painted buntings just arrived back from up north. And you can see those right in the visitor center. We have a feeder set up, and it's an opportunity to see this magnificently beautiful bird. The first time you see this bird, you're like, wow, I didn't know those colors existed on a bird. So always something cool to see out there. Of course, we have to have the obligatory alligators, depending on different times of year. And we also have otters. Otters on the boardwalk are not unusual, actually. They're pretty normal. Lots of otters out there in the swamp and on the boardwalk, so it definitely happens. And there's lots of other stuff to do on the boardwalk, including we have many tours. We have tours, ancient forest tours, moonlight tours, lots of other tours that you can do, birding tours. However, we are 13,000 acres and we are private property. And you can only see less than 1% of the property from the boardwalk. Actually, we calculated out at 0.02%. So this is the part where we like to say we are more than a boardwalk. We are the key link in the Western Everglades. That box right there is Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, and all the green around it is actually land that was acquired by the counties, by the Water Management District to help protect Corkscrew Swamp and the watershed. This is the Corkscrew Regional Ecosystem Watershed. And so this shows how important that this place is in the overall landscape. And you can see that we've been surrounded on all sides now by development. So really thankful for those who took place in helping acquiring those lands in the past. Of course, we provide many important ecosystem services, aquifer recharge. I think people forget about that until you see some of these droughts that we have, and there's have been wells running dry in Southwest Florida in the past years. Floodwater storage. Doug was just asking me how the swamp is doing right now. It's nice and full of water. It's doing its job. Water quality. The water in Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary is statistically the cleanest water in Southwest Florida. So you think about water in a swamp being clean, it is very, very clean water. And so it's very important. And habitat for endangered animals. And I'll talk more about that. But the water in the swamp has been a concern. We were blessed with that somebody in our past started establishing water level monitoring. And we have over 60 years of data. And we started looking back at the data and we saw some alarming changes. Not only in the swamp forest, but in some of those other habitats, our hydro period, or how long the water remains on the landscape, has dramatically dropped. 30% shorter in the marshes, and 2 months shorter in the bald cypress and the pond cypress, which is the deepest part of the swamp, 2 months shorter. That means these areas actually go dry quite a bit. Historically, we had a nice, wonderful sheet flow from the northeast to the southwest. As you know, in South Florida, there's very few rivers, even though there's 3 rivers named here. Those are just kind of creeks by the coast. And so that sheet flow flows down and fills those creeks. Now, because of channelization, canalization, water management, flood protection, this is not a new story anywhere in South Florida. This is very common all through the Everglades ecosystem, as well as Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. There were some improvements made for flooding in the 90s, in the actually 2000s, in response to some flooding from El Nino and Tropical Storm Jerry back in 1995, which was a pretty significant flood event. And unfortunately, the changes really did their job. They really changed the hydrology. So why is hydrology important? You've probably heard that word. Well, I think you can base it back to a few key pieces. And one of them is wildlife. I talked about that swamp going dry. And when that swamp goes dry, it resets the entire system. If you've been out on the boardwalk, probably in March, April, May, you may have heard or seen the feeding frenzy. That's when all the wading birds come out and they're eating all the fish because the water is drying down so much. Well, the problem is the water keeps dropping and dropping and dropping to where there's no water left in the swamp. That reset, taking all those fish, all those invertebrates, and all those animals out of the ecosystem, is so hard to recover from every single year. So while we are thrilled for the birds and the feeding frenzy, there still should be deeper pools in the swamp, which currently don't exist because of the overdraining hydrology. And of course, creatures like alligators, they live their entire lives and they depend on these swamp ecosystems. So very important. Plants like the ghost orchid. The ghost orchid needs that water in the swamp. It helps maintain humidity and a microclimate so that it can exist in places where nothing else can. And these ghost orchids cannot be found very many places outside these swamps because they need that microclimate. They're very sensitive to cold. They're very sensitive to drying out. And so that is a very important place for them. When we start changing hydrology, things get drier and fire risk becomes a serious issue. Down here in Collier County, in the past 10 years, we've had some of the largest wildfires in the history of the county. Where I live, I was actually under mandatory evacuation for the biggest one. And I'll tell you, it is scary. And so the risk of fire is not only to the swamp and these habitats, but also to people. And so we really want to be able to keep fire off the landscape, except where we want to put it on the landscape and prescribe fire, because these wildfires can be large and damaging. And frankly, it's the thing that keeps me up at night the most. Water storage. After Hurricane Ian, we had record levels of water in the swamp. The swamp did its job and it kept water out of people's houses. So we encourage people to really think about, these swamps aren't just these deep, dark places. You'd much rather have water staying in that swamp doing its job than in a house. So water storage, what these places are so important for. And then, of course, estuaries. Corkscrew connects to the coast. The water that comes through Corkscrew goes right out Wiggins Pass, goes right out these other places. And so when you're sending that clean water to the coast, it's so important. And Floridians know over the past 20 years, what we have seen is time and time again is some really sad news on our coast of these algae blooms, of red tide, of all kinds of terrible things that happen. Well, that is happening because polluted waters are coming to the coast, which makes the connection between inland wetlands that are in good shape and the coast so much more important. One of the other big problems with change hydrology is it changes how plants grow. There's this plant, it's called Carolina willow. It's a native plant. It belongs in the landscape, but wow, it is aggressive. And anytime you change the hydrology, it gets a little bit drier, this stuff can come in pretty quick. What you're looking at here is a field of Carolina willow. You can't run a fire through here. We try to burn this, it's impossible. Wildlife habitat. There's water underneath this. There are fish and beings underneath this, but to a wading bird, this is a desert. They can't feed there. So you lose all that wildlife habitat. Carolina willow also uses much, much more water than the native grasses which were out there. And also inaccessible for exotics control. You can't walk through this. There's no way without chainsaws and a whole bunch of people, it is inaccessible. So this is really tough stuff. And it came in because of this change hydrology. And this is what we call shrubification. If you look at this map, these are all this light green is areas that are now Carolina willow dominated. And these areas are changed because of that change in hydrology and also lack of fire back in the day. And so those areas used to be high functioning wet prairies and marshes, which were so important to wading birds, such as the wood stork, which historically had its largest colonies at Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. So it's not just a local problem, but it's a regional and it's actually becoming a worldwide problem. So our solution to this has been to get in and take action. And one thing in Florida is if we care about ecosystems, we can't just sit back and let them take care of themselves anymore. We have to step in and we have to make some action. And this looks drastic. We bring in these vehicles, they're called gyro tracks, and they mulch all these trees right down to the ground. They've got this big barrel with big teeth and just mulches everything down. You may have seen one doing land clearing in some place, but we're able to come in at a precise time of year in that dry season. And we have about a 4 to 6 week window, depending on the year, when it's dry enough for this piece of equipment to get out there and reach these areas and mulch this. And so they'll go through, they'll go back and forth, just mulching these areas so we can remove this willow. So to give you an idea what it looks like before, if you look at this picture in the upper left and upper right, you see a little bit of brownish greenish. That's cattail back there. The rest is willow. After they go in and remove it, you can see how open it is, and you can actually still see some of that cattail that's there. They actually worked around the cattail. This is immediately 6 months after restoration. We didn't do any planting. This is all the seed bank, which is there all along. So we just released this. We turned this from a place where birds couldn't feed, wildlife couldn't really get through, to basically what it should look like in a really happily functioning ecosystem. And then the final step is to come in and do prescribed burns in the area. At that point, we can really begin to turn the clock on restoration. And you can see kind of in the front there, we have a little bit of Carolina willow and some other grasses. The trick with Carolina willow is it does not survive fire. So you have to kill the willow, you have to mow it down. Some is going to grow back, but you have to get enough vegetation that can actually carry fire in the area. And then you run your prescribed fire through, it burns the vegetation and it kills the willow. So it really knocks it back. It also, prescribed fire also has a ton of other important uses. It's very important for plant germination. It's important for nutrient cycling. I literally could do an 1.5-hour webinar just on the benefits of prescribed fire, but it is one of our most important tools that we use and land managers use throughout South Florida. So anytime you see, one of your natural areas that has some smoke on it, thank those folks who are doing a really good job, because they're not only managing those lands, but the more these lands are controlled with lower fuels, the less chance there is of a damaging wildfire to start there and escape into rural areas, which is obviously very scary. And this is a picture that was taken about 9 months post restoration. Those are great egrets. Those are nearly all great egrets. And this is what this ecosystem looks like when you can restore it back and you can allow access to these things. And so the egrets come back. We've had rafts of white pelicans, hundreds deep, roseate spoonbills, you name it out there, wood storks. And so it's incredibly rewarding. I've done several restoration projects in my career. And this is probably the most instant gratification one you can possibly think of because, from shredding to water to birds on the landscape, it's just a few months and it really does make a huge difference. And we have done a phenomenal job. We have actually, this number is old, 1,400 acres under restoration. We've still got about 300 acres we're trying to get to. Different years, I mentioned that rainfall, different years let us get deeper to some areas. This past year, winter with El Nino, we weren't able to get into any area because it actually stayed wet all winter. And so while that was kind of a downer for us doing restoration work, what it allowed us to do is allow the ecosystem continue to grow fish and grow invertebrates and grow all these things throughout the winter. So I'd actually take it as a positive instead of a negative. So, and we're hoping to get in there in the future. And I definitely want to thank our corporate sponsors, SeaWorld, Community Foundation of Collier County, Arthrex, and especially Publix. Publix has been such a huge supporter of this. They truly care about conservation work and water conservation in the state of Florida. So you almost can't talk about anything in South Florida these days without talking about pythons. And of course, these are Burmese pythons. And if you haven't heard about Burmese pythons, you probably haven't looked at social media news reports or anything. This is one of our biologists, Alex Minders. He was on a training mission to learn how to catch pythons. And so this is a bigger one that's on the right. I think I was there for that one. And of course, they get big. I think this one was about 18 feet, and it's not even a state record. So you can imagine these things out on the landscape. They are machines. They take everything out. And once they reach a certain length, nothing can stop them. An alligator cannot compete with an animal like this. They certainly will lose in any kind of fight like that. So one of the things that was discovered with pythons when they initially invaded Everglades National Park was that the rangers and biologists started noticing there was no wildlife. There were no possums, there were no raccoons, there were no rabbits. And that's because the pythons took out everything, even the deer in some cases. And so with that understanding, we know that we have something that we can monitor for to see, if you can find these snakes on the landscape, because they're very cryptic, they're very hard to find, and they're very sneaky. And so what we want to do is we want to have an index of how the wildlife is doing to let us know, hey, maybe there's something big going on, because it's not a question of if, unfortunately, a question of when. So what we did is we gathered mammal data, we had camera traps, and we analyzed almost 1 million images. And it took about 10 years to get all these images together. And Corkscrew Swamp, we came out and we found that we have lots of wildlife. Our wildlife numbers actually are increasing because of our restoration work. And it's very common to open up these cameras and you're going to see lots of these kind of meso-sized mammals, these rabbits, these possums, raccoons, lots of bobcats, and the larger animals, white-tailed deer, coyotes, black bear, and Florida panthers. And just one aside on Florida panthers, we have some of the largest Florida panther populations of anywhere in the U.S. Somebody from the Fish and Wildlife Commission told me we are the pantheriest place in the state of Florida. We have all these wonderful habitats, and we have these back trails that we use that are these old roads. And so the panthers use them as well. And so at any time, there's probably a panther somewhere on our property. It took me 364 days to see my first panther at Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. It was a mother and 2 kittens. And I'll tell you, until you see one in life, you can't quite understand the gravity of what that's like. That was one of the species which almost blinked off the face of the earth, and we were able to save it. One of my other staff, who spends a lot of time in the backcountry, has seen over 50 panthers over 17 years. So they're definitely out there. One actually walked right through campus the other day, and actually we have a little library structure. Walked right in front of the library, walked right down our sidewalk. So they're out there. So it's really cool. So lots of panthers going on out there. So yeah, what we've seen is that our populations are stable and our mammals actually increasing over time. So that tells us there's no obvious signs of impacts to mammals from these large invasive snakes. And encourage everybody, this isn't just something that biologists or natural resource managers or police or FWC can do. This is something that anybody can get involved in. You can sign up and be part of the Python patrol. You can become a contractor. If you really want to be Florida man, you can go out there and you can catch pythons for a living. And of course, there's some apps out there. Get it on Google Play, get it on the App Store. It's called I've Got One. And you can say, geolocate, I have a python right here. And that will notify somebody who will come out and try to find that python and remove it off the landscape. This is one of the greatest threats to our Florida ecosystems. And so we want to get everybody's involvement to really make a difference, because governments and nonprofits, we can't do it alone. We need the public to really help us with this. At the sanctuary, we also offer some educational programs. I mentioned that you can see very little of what we call the backcountry from the boardwalk. We now have several opportunities to get in the backcountry to see this. You can bring your own bike. We can actually do a bike tour so you can see some of these habitats where those panthers are at. We have an opportunity to do swamp walks. Check our calendars. I've done these swamp walks. They're so cool to get out there and be safely in this environment around all these trees, around all this wildlife. It is just absolutely magical. So I definitely encourage you to look at a swamp walk. We also host Florida Master Naturalist class. People who are interested in the environment and want to learn more about Florida, especially if you're not from here, you're not a biologist, this is a great way to do it. We offer several programs, and then local school programs. We have over 101 school programs that are signed up for this year coming up. That's fourth grade, seventh grade, and I think fifth grade. And so getting these local kids out here and having them a sense of place of how important Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary is just so important. And of course, all this effort is supported by the public. Yeah, and really growing them into stewards. I mean, how often is kids going to get an opportunity to go out there and grab a net and catch a little grass shrimp or catch a little crayfish or something like that? And so this real sense of place, and I think getting people really involved at a young age is important. I grew up in Southwest Florida, grew up in Cape Coral, actually. And there was this gentleman by the name of Bill Hammond, who's a legend in Southwest Florida. And he would take kids out to 6 Mile Cypress Swamp in Fort Myers and get them wet. And so I was one of those kids, and I was the only kid, I think, who was really happy to be up to my neck in a swamp. And I think it definitely made a difference in where my career went. So just never know what those little moments will really mean down the road. We also have a very, very cool nature store, lots of environmental gifts. We have fair trade. We have lots of bird boxes. This is one of our new things. We're building bird boxes from some of the old wood, which is on the boardwalk, which is the wood from the boardwalk is a whole nother story that I could do a webinar about. So check out our gift store. We have lots of cool stuff in there before or after your trip on our 2.25 mile boardwalk. And while you're there in season, stop by the cafe, get some lunch, get some breakfast. We have coffee, lots of good things there. So lots of opportunities to stay hydrated and stay full. We also are increasingly offering really neat opportunities, private events for weddings, indoors and outdoors, remembrance celebrations. We have this outdoor amphitheater, which is there on the lower left. And that is where I actually know those folks who got married. Of course, they're biologists in the area. And it's an absolutely spectacular setting to get married in the swamp. It's just an amazing place. And you are really right there standing with 500-year-old trees right behind you. So it's just an amazing experience. Also, we cannot do what we do without our volunteers. We are so grateful to all the hard work they do. They're out there trimming up vegetation. They're out there on the boardwalk as master naturalists. We're short-staffed, So our master naturalists are the one on the boardwalk who can tell you what that bird is, what that plant is, what that noise is, what's going on over here. And they're absolutely so excited about it. We've had some volunteers who've been coming once or twice a week for 20 years. And they just absolutely love the place and we value them. They're part of our family. They also do other great things. They're out there fixing the boardwalk. Let me tell you, as managing a facility, 2.25 miles of wood is a lot to maintain. And so if anybody has carpentry skills out there in Collier County, would love to come down and volunteer, please let me know. We can always use your help. Our volunteers also help in our school program. So they are so important. We could not do our school programs without our volunteers for helping lead those classes on a daily basis and helping our science team. We have volunteers who go out in the backcountry. They're helping sample fish, they're helping sample vegetation. And so just lots of cool opportunities. Anything you can think of, we can probably find a spot for you there. And I do want to mention, this is our 70th anniversary this year, 1954. And to help celebrate it, I just want to show some of our plans for the future. We are in the middle of a capital campaign right now. We have not been able to maintain much other than boardwalk for the past 70 years in the backcountry. It's when you're a small nonprofit, you tend to throw all your money in the backcountry, you tend to throw all your money at the environment. And so we realized that we really needed to have some space so that we can have more classrooms, education, we can have laboratory space, we can have office space, rooms for collaboration. And so this is our vision for a future campus. A local architect in town, David Corbin, is a phenomenal architect. And right now you're looking at what will be the future. That is the John Jack Hayward Western Everglades Research Center, laboratories on site. And the exciting part of that for us is that we have lots of folks who want to come do research, but we don't have laboratory space. If we have laboratory space, they can come, they can do their research, and they get more results, and we can learn more about how the system functions, which benefits us and them. We also have new spaces for our public engagement team. And of course, the Paul Pachter Outdoor Classroom. And this is going to be a really neat space. It gets the kids a little bit further away from the parking lot, gets them in this back area. And we have this building, which, is going to be an outdoor classroom. But when it gets too hot and buggy in the summer, we can close it right up. We can still have this big, beautiful space. And right there to the right is something we're envisioning called mini lettuce lakes. It'll be sort of a touch tank, but a freshwater version. So we'll have kids be able to go net their own little grass shrimp and net their own mosquito fish in there. So just a cool opportunity for kids to get really engaged and be, very part of the landscape. And obviously we thank our major donors who've helped us with this work. We still have a ways to go. We are currently working on plans also to add a significant need, which is dormitory space. And this is so important for interns. Interns are so important to what we do, and we support them because they grow with us and we grow with them. And my internship at the University of Florida doing alligator research is one of the most important things I did. So having a space where interns don't have to come down and try to find housing in Southwest Florida is just absolutely critical. And so we can have them on site and be able to further their careers and support what we do. So like I said, 1954, we spoke up, we saved the swamp, but the fight continues today. If you've heard anything about Southwest Florida, the growth is serious. So we still need your voices to advocate for a healthy future for the sanctuary and our surrounding communities. You can help us. You can become an annual member. You can make a donation. You can include us in your state plans, or you can become a volunteer. So there's lots of opportunities. And of course, just visiting makes a difference. So we just want you, folks, just come out and see the place. And I think see what's right in your backyard, this natural gem here in Florida. So with that, I'll stop for questions.
Okay, thank you, Keith. That last photograph is incredible with the baby owls. Were they barred owls or great horned owls?
Those are barred owls. Yeah, we have
yeah.
On the boardwalk. That's actually one of our more common birds. If you don't go out and you don't hear who cooks for you, then come back the next time because you'll probably hear it. And sometimes they're literally sitting on the boardwalk. They're awesome animals.
All right, thank you. Well, that was very inspiring. So I hope that inspires everybody to visit and become active at Corkscrew Swamp. And let me open it up for questions. So go ahead and type questions in the chat, but I have a couple for you. you mentioned on the ghost orchid. So when was the last time it bloomed? You mentioned it bloomed 3 times this summer. Is that right?
It just bloomed actually 2 weeks ago was the
2 weeks
last.
ago.
Yeah, and we were able to get a National Geographic photographer by the name of Max Stone. And
Mm-hmm.
look him up. Max Stone is the real deal. He's also a biologist by training, conservationist, and so he came down and he climbed the tree and he got up close and personal shots. He was able to document it, and he was able to get some information and put some sensors up so we can learn a little bit more about that. And when Mac went up there, he was climbing this tree, and Mac's about 5'10", and I saw the ghost orchid next to his thigh, and I realized the ghost orchid is huge. The
Mm.
whole root mat is we couldn't believe how big it was because you're looking out there, you're just seeing these little flowers. So it is a very significant plant, and it's super famous.
Mm. Sure is. And you mentioned a Florida panther was seen recently. Like how recent was it?
We saw one. It was last week on campus, actually.
Last week. Wow.
And there's of course the very famous video of a
Right.
woman walking down the boardwalk, and then in I think April, a visitor came in to the center, and they showed a picture on their phone to our staff, and they said, "Is this normal?" It was a panther taking a nap on the boardwalk, and they took a picture, and nobody else saw it. So it's amazing that panthers, they're smart. This is a nice dry space. Of course, they're going to use
Yeah.
that to avoid going through the swamp.
Yeah, I've hiked the Florida Trail, and usually that's the where the bears mark the trail because they like a cleared area through the swamp, and you'll see a lot of markings of bears on trails. Um, so the best way for volunteers to get involved is just to you have a volunteer coordinator, or they
Yeah.
just call up, or what?
Yep, we do have a volunteer coordinator. You just go right to our website and you can apply to be a volunteer. Just a great opportunity. We have, obviously some folks who volunteer year round, but our main season for lots of people is obviously, like anywhere in South Florida, it's like December through April. So that's when we have most of our volunteers, but always something for volunteers to do and help us out.
Excellent. And about how many volunteers do you have?
We have about 115 right now. And so always opportunities for new ones. Yep.
Excellent. And how many school kids usually come visit every year? I assume it's popular for field trips.
So let's see, these classes, we've got 100 classes coming up, probably 30 kids a class, and then miscellaneous others. So, we can have 5,000 kids a year come out,
Wow.
so yeah,
What a
and it's,
resource. Yeah.
well, and the amazing part for us is we do a lot of focus on Title I schools. And for us to be able to have kids from Immokalee who are right up the road who've never been to Corkscrew, I mean, it's a really amazing experience to see these kids be able to experience this place. So very special.
Yeah. And just like what you said about being inspired by as a kid on a field trip, I've met other public managers that the same way they just went on one field trip and that's what they wanted to be as like a ranger or whatever. And so it's very important. Okay, I don't see any questions right now, so I'm going to a lot of thank yous. And so it's very good talk, and I look forward to my next visit. I'm sorry I will live so far away, um, but so thank you very much, Keith, for a very excellent talk. And so next month, I just wanted to mention we'll be learning about the 1,500-mile Florida National Scenic Trail with the executive director, Royce Gibson. So that's a great way to see Florida as well, because it covers most every habitat type in the state. Um, and if you have any questions, feel free to email us at Office of Greenways and Trails at floridadep.gov. So thank you for joining everybody, and thank you very much, Keith. And hope I'll see you down the trail somewhere. Thank you.
Happy trails. Thanks all.
All right. Bye bye.